Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, to a corner of history that people love to romanticize, but which, in reality, was much less glamorous. We're talking about medieval assassins, not the sleek, hooded rooftop acrobats of modern fiction, but the real men who lived short, anxious, and usually rather disappointing lives. So, settle in, dim the lights, and relax, because we're going to unravel why being a medieval assassin was, frankly, a terrible career choice. When most people hear the word assassin, they picture the Nizari Ismailis of the Middle East, sometimes known as the Order of Assassins. These were the figures who gave us the word itself, and they were active between the 11th and 13th centuries. Their story has been wrapped in so many layers of myth that it's hard to see what was actually happening. Outsiders claimed they were drugged with hashish before missions, hence the origin of the word hashishin, though modern historians doubt this. It was probably just a convenient slander invented by enemies who needed to explain why young men would volunteer for suicidal missions. After all, if you can't understand loyalty, you assume drugs are involved. When most people hear the word assassin, they picture the Nizari Ismailis of the Middle East, sometimes known as the Order of Assassins. These were the figures who gave us the word itself, and they were active between the 11th and 13th centuries. Their story has been wrapped in so many layers of myth that it's hard to see what was actually happening. Outsiders claimed they were drugged with hashish before missions, hence the origin of the word hashishin, though modern historians doubt this. It was probably just a convenient slander invented by enemies who needed to explain why young men would volunteer for suicidal missions. After all, if you can't understand loyalty, you assume drugs are involved. This brings us to the first reason why it sucked. There was no retirement plan. A medieval blacksmith might work until his hands gave out, then sit in the sun and tell stories. A farmer might pass his fields to his children and hope to live quietly until the next plague came through. But an assassin, the expectation was that you would die on mission. Success meant death. Failure meant death. Even indecision often led to death. It was, in short, a one-way path, and not a very scenic one. Now, picture your living conditions. Forget the cinematic mountaintop fortress filled with lush gardens and beautiful courtyards. Yes, the Nizori strongholds were impressive for their time, places like Alamet in modern-day Iran. But impressive in the 12th century doesn't mean comfortable. It meant cold stone walls, drafty halls, limited food supplies, and the constant stress of living under siege. These fortresses were targets for crusaders, rival dynasties, and later Mongols. So while you were being trained for missions, you were also frequently preparing for your home to be attacked. It wasn't a relaxing place to grow up. Your diet would hardly inspire poetry. Bread that was more brick than loaf. Porridge that was more gruel than meal. A bit of goat's milk, if you were lucky, or dried fruit if supplies hadn't spoiled. If you had the idea that assassins were pampered elites, erase it. They were functionaries, disposable tools. They ate what everyone else ate, which in most cases was bland, minimal, and never quite enough. The training itself was no better. You were expected to learn discipline, stealth, and above all, obedience. You might be taught languages, disguises, or how to move unnoticed in a crowd. But what you weren't taught was how to live freely. Your education was shaped entirely by the mission you would one day be ordered to perform. And unlike knights, who could at least expect a bit of glory and recognition, assassins weren't celebrated openly. Their deeds were whispered about, feared, and then usually forgotten after their violent deaths. And speaking of death, let's talk about what a mission really looked like. Forget the acrobatics of leaping between rooftops or the elegant swoop of a hidden blade. Missions usually meant walking directly into danger, approaching a target in public, often in a mosque, palace, or court, and striking before being cut down by guards. It wasn't about surviving. It was about proving that no one, not even a king or a general, was safe. Imagine the psychological pressure of that knowledge. You are preparing your entire life not to live, but to be an expendable example. The stress of such missions cannot be overstated. You would spend weeks, sometimes months, in disguise, waiting for the right moment. You might pose as a servant, a tradesman, or even a monk, all while knowing that if you slipped up even slightly, you'd be caught and killed. And unlike in stories, there were no second chances. Medieval prisons were not forgiving, and interrogations were not gentle. The margin for error was razor thin. Now, let's talk about weapons. Everyone likes to imagine the assassin's arsenal: poison, daggers, maybe even exotic contraptions. The reality was depressingly simple. Most often, it was just a knife. Effective, yes, but hardly glamorous. Poison was sometimes used, but medieval poison was as unreliable as medieval medicine. Doses were tricky, mixtures unstable, and results uncertain. Your target might die, or they might simply vomit and carry on, while you found yourself exposed. Daggers, at least, were reliable, but they required you to get close, very close, which, again, meant you weren't leaving the scene alive. And even if you did succeed, what did you win? There was no pile of gold waiting for your family, no estates handed down in your honor. At best, your sacrifice might be remembered within the community. At worst, you'd be forgotten entirely, another nameless tool in a long series of expendable lives. You didn't get statues. You didn't get songs. You got a knife, an order, and then silence. This is where the great irony lies. The legends that grew around assassins, the tales of stealthy masters of shadows, bear little resemblance to the reality. The truth was harsher, duller, and much more depressing. These were young men, often barely adults, caught in the machinery of politics and religion, trained to die for causes they couldn't question. They weren't living glamorous lives in hoods and hidden towers. They were shivering in drafty rooms, eating stale bread, and waiting for the order that would end their brief, unhappy careers. So when you think of medieval assassins, remember that the real men behind the myths weren't symbols of freedom or power. They were the opposite, bound by duty, robbed of choice, and doomed from the start. It sucked to be a medieval assassin, because at the end of the day, your story was never truly yours. And on that gentle note, let's drift into the next stage of their misery, the grueling training. the indoctrination, and the endless pressure of preparing for a mission you knew you wouldn't survive. That's where we'll pick things up. So, you've been recruited, or perhaps more accurately absorbed, into the world of the assassins. You're young, impressionable, and already realizing this is not quite the exciting career path that storytellers will one day pretend it was. Before you're even trusted with a dagger, you must go through training, which, as you might expect, was not especially fun. Let's start with where you were living. Many recruits were raised in fortresses like Alamet, that legendary stronghold perched in the Alborz mountains of Persia. From a distance, these castles seemed impressive, perched on cliffs like something out of a fantasy novel. Up close, though, they were drafty, isolated, and perpetually short on supplies. Food had to be hauled up narrow paths by stubborn mules. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Winters were brutal, and summers sweltering. These weren't luxurious palaces. They were survival bunkers, and you were growing up inside one, with little to do besides train, eat, and wait for someone to notice whether you were useful. The food deserves a moment of reflection. Imagine being told you're training for destiny while your dinner is, once again, a gray lump of barley porridge. Bread was the staple, but it was the sort of bread that cracked teeth rather than nourished souls. Cheese was a rare treat. Meat, even rarer, unless you counted goat, which most recruits probably learned to loathe. Water was precious. Wine was for leaders, and you drank what was given without complaint. Modern depictions always show assassins as lean and athletic, but in reality, many were probably malnourished, undersized, and perpetually exhausted. Then there was the indoctrination. Every community has its stories, its values, its way of shaping the minds of the young. In the case of the assassins, loyalty was everything. You were told that your life had meaning only if you gave it up when commanded. You were trained to obey without hesitation, because hesitation in the field would mean disaster. This wasn't a school that encouraged creativity or independent thinking. It was more like a lifelong conditioning program designed to turn you into a willing sacrifice. Your elders promised rewards in the afterlife, gardens, peace, eternal honor, though it's hard to imagine how much comfort that offered when you were staring down the reality of a mission. Training also included skills that, on paper, sound useful. Languages, for instance, so that you could move among different communities without drawing suspicion. Some learned bits of Greek, Latin, or Turkish, depending on where they might be sent. You were also taught how to blend in, how to dress like a merchant, how to carry yourself like a servant, even how to kneel like a pious worshiper. These were the disguises that gave you a slim chance of reaching your target. But these lessons weren't glamorous. They weren't about becoming a master of shadows. They were about pretending to be ordinary, so ordinary that no one noticed you until it was too late. Weapons training, too, was depressingly simple. Daggers, short swords, occasionally bows, though those were less useful in the tight quarters where many assassinations took place. Forget exotic weapons or hidden gadgets. The hidden blade of video games is a charming invention, but no medieval recruit had access to such engineering marvels. You had steel, you had your own two hands, and you had orders to get close enough to use them. And then there was the waiting. Training was not a constant flurry of activity. Much of it was monotonous. You woke up, you prayed, you ate your stale bread, and then you practiced walking silently, or holding a disguise, or repeating lessons on loyalty, hour after hour, day after day. If you imagine medieval knights jousting and training in tournaments, think of the assassin's equivalent as sitting quietly in a corner, trying not to look suspicious. It wasn't glamorous. It was mind-numbing. Life inside the fortress also came with its own anxieties. You were never far from danger because the assassin's enemies never really stopped trying to destroy them. Crusaders plotted to storm their strongholds. Rival Muslim dynasties wanted them gone. And eventually, the Mongols would roll through with such overwhelming force that all the loyalty in the world couldn't stop them. So, while you were being trained to infiltrate and kill, you also lived with the constant knowledge that any day your home might be under siege. For a teenager growing up in this environment, it was hardly the stuff of heroic legend. Another important detail, there was no real camaraderie. Unlike a knightly order, where warriors bonded in brotherhood and swore oaths together, assassins were trained individually, tested individually, and often deployed alone. You weren't part of a glorious band of brothers. You were a tool in someone else's pocket. If you failed, there was no rescue mission. If you succeeded, there was no celebration. You might get a nod of approval before being sent on the next mission. It was a lonely existence, and loneliness rarely makes for a peaceful life. Let's not forget about discipline. Punishments for disobedience were severe. Leaders couldn't afford half-hearted loyalty, so if a recruit showed reluctance, they were reminded of the consequences. Sometimes that meant public examples, sometimes quiet disappearances. Everyone understood the rules. You obeyed, or you didn't exist for long. That kind of pressure wears on the mind. It hollowed out the recruits until obedience was second nature, which, of course, was the point. It's also worth remembering that most of these recruits were very young. Some were barely teenagers when they were selected, which meant they never really knew another kind of life. Imagine being 14, pulled from your family, and told that your purpose was to grow up just enough to throw your life away for the cause. Some probably accepted it. Others probably dreamed of escape, but escape was dangerous. Leaving the fold wasn't easy, and deserters risked being hunted down. You belonged to the order until your death, whether you liked it or not. And even for those who embraced it, the training didn't guarantee success. Many recruits never even made it to a mission. They died in raids, succumbed to illness in those bleak fortresses, or were quietly discarded when judged unfit. Those who did graduate to field work knew full well that their time was short. Their career, if you could even call it that, might consist of one mission, one chance to stab a powerful man before being immediately cut down. You can imagine the mood this created. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't pride. It was resignation. So when people talk about assassin training as though it produced elite shadow warriors, it's worth slowing down and imagining the truth. Endless drills, cold stone floors, gruel for dinner, long sermons about loyalty, the occasional scream of an enemy raid echoing through the mountains, and the constant reminder that all of this effort was preparing you not for life, but for death. That was the reality. And it wasn't even the hardest part, because once training ended, you were sent into the world, into crowded cities, dangerous courts, and hostile armies, where your job was to blend in, wait, and then strike, which is where we'll drift next. The grim reality of missions, and why stepping into the role of a medieval assassin was less a life of adventure and more a slow walk toward an early grave. So, you've survived the training, you've eaten your brick like bread, you've whispered your oaths of loyalty, and you've mastered the fine art of standing very still without being noticed. Congratulations. Now you're ready for the real test, your first mission. And here is where the reality of being a medieval assassin becomes, if possible, even less glamorous. First, let's remember the basic rule. Success meant death. Failure meant death. And hesitation? Yes, that usually meant death too. It's a catchy little slogan, isn't it? But it was the daily reality. You weren't heading out into the world with hopes of coming back home. You were heading out knowing this was likely the last trip you would ever make, and that knowledge sat in your stomach like a stone. Now picture the scene. You've been given your target, perhaps a powerful vizier in Baghdad, perhaps a crusader lord in Syria, perhaps even a rival imam. Whoever it is, he's surrounded by guards, servants, and suspicious family members who would be more than happy to skewer you on the spot. Your job is to get close enough to strike, and then, well, then nothing. No escape plan, no rooftop getaway, just the sharp end of a sword and the knowledge that you'd made your point. To pull this off, you'd need a disguise, and medieval disguises were rarely convincing. You might dress as a humble merchant, clutching a basket of goods you couldn't afford. You might pose as a servant, head down, trying not to make eye contact. You might even slip into a mosque as a worshiper, kneeling in prayer beside your target, dagger hidden in your sleeve. And all the while, your hands would tremble, your mouth would dry out, and your heart would beat loud enough that you were sure someone would hear it. The waiting was the worst part. Missions didn't happen in a single day. You could spend weeks, even months, shadowing your target, waiting for the perfect moment. You had to eat, sleep, and live in disguise, blending into a community that wasn't yours. Every knock at the door, every sideways glance in the market could be the moment you were discovered. Imagine lying awake at night in some cheap rented room, dagger under your pillow, wondering whether you'd be dragged out by soldiers before morning. That was the daily rhythm of a mission. And then came the strike itself. Let's pause for a moment and think about how awkward medieval assassination must have been. A dagger is not an elegant weapon. It doesn't glide through armor. It doesn't guarantee silence. You had to get close, push, struggle, and hope. The target might scream. The guards would definitely scream. And you, poor soul, were standing right there in the middle of it. Even if you succeeded, your triumph lasted perhaps 10 seconds before you were torn apart by angry swordsmen. One famous example comes from 1192, when Conrad of Montferrat, the newly elected king of Jerusalem, was stabbed by assassins disguised as monks. Picture it: pious robes, solemn faces, all concealing sharp daggers. They approached Conrad in the street, bowed respectfully, and then drove their blades into him. The mission succeeded, but naturally, the assassins were cut down instantly. The message had been delivered, but the men who delivered it didn't live to enjoy the applause. Success meant death, always death. Another case was that of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, killed in 1092. An assassin disguised as a wandering holy man approached him one evening and struck. Again, mission accomplished. Again, assassin dead. The cycle repeated over and over. Each assassin was a tool, used once and discarded. The leaders of the sect boasted of their reach. Their enemies lived in constant fear. But the individuals carrying out the work, they were ghosts before they even began. And here's another hook worth repeating. No matter how dramatic the mission, the political outcome was rarely what the assassins might have hoped. One ruler died, but another quickly stepped in. A vizier was removed, but his replacement usually had the same policies. The wheel of power turned, grinding up assassins, while history barely noticed their names. Let's not overlook the failures, though, because for every successful stabbing, there were plenty of botched attempts. The target spotted something suspicious. The dagger slipped. A guard intervened. And when that happened, the punishment was not swift or merciful. Captured assassins faced interrogations that we won't linger on here, but you can safely assume they were not soothing bedtime experiences. Then came public executions, burning, flaying, hanging, designed to show everyone just how foolish it was to try. So yes, failure meant death, but it also meant humiliation and agony before the end. And yet, the cycle continued. Recruits kept being sent. Missions kept unfolding. Why? Because for the leaders, it worked. Enemies lived in fear. Armies hesitated. Rulers slept uneasily. The psychological effect was enormous. But for the individual assassin, there was nothing heroic in it. Just weeks of waiting, one desperate lunge, and then silence. Now let's linger on the psychological toll for a moment. Imagine knowing that you will die young, that your mission is essentially a carefully choreographed suicide, that you'll never see your family again, never build a life, never even enjoy a peaceful evening without fear of discovery. What kind of mindset does that create? Perhaps some found comfort in the promises of paradise. Perhaps others simply resign themselves to fate. But either way, the weight of inevitability hung over every step, every glance, every whispered prayer. And here's where the myths get particularly cruel. Centuries later, storytellers turn these miserable, doomed young men into glamorous figures, cloaked in mystery, skilled in every art, leaping from rooftops and vanishing into shadows. But the reality was not a ballet of blades. It was mud, sweat, fear, and the constant awareness that time was short. The assassin's real story was not one of freedom, but of captivity to an idea, a leader, and a death sentence waiting to be carried out. So the next time you hear the word assassin and imagine elegance, remember the truth. Disguise, waiting, stabbing, dying. That was the rhythm. And the refrain remains the same. Success meant death, Failure meant death. Hesitation meant death. A short, grim melody played out over and over in the shadows of history. And with that refrain still echoing softly, let's drift toward the next chapter of misery, the famous failures and the short-lived successes. Because nothing highlights the futility of it all quite like watching men throw themselves into history's fire, only to be forgotten a heartbeat later. So far, we've drifted through the grim realities of missions, the disguises, the waiting, the sudden lunge, and the inevitable silence afterward. But nothing shows the futility of this profession quite as clearly as the stories of individual assassins. They were promised glory, feared as shadows in the night, whispered about in chronicles. And yet, when we look closer, their stories all seem to end the same way. A little triumph, followed by a lot of blood, and then, usually, the complete indifference of history. Let's begin with the tale of Conrad of Montferrat. We touched on him earlier, but his story deserves a slower stroll. It was 1192, and Conrad had just been elected king of Jerusalem. This sounds impressive, of course, except that Jerusalem, by this point, wasn't actually in Christian hands. Small detail. Still, he was a powerful man, and power inevitably drew the attention of the assassins. Two men approached him in the streets of Tyre, dressed in the robes of monks. That was the trick, piety as camouflage. Imagine Conrad's thoughts. Here were two humble, religious men, perhaps offering blessings. And then, in an instant, the daggers were out. Conrad was stabbed repeatedly and collapsed in the street. A mission completed, the sex influence once again confirmed, and the assassins, dead within moments, cut down by Conrad's furious guards. Their names weren't recorded. Their triumph lasted less than a heartbeat. Success meant death, always. Now let's glide back to 1092, to the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier of the Seljuk Empire. He was one of the most powerful men of his time, the kind of figure who shaped empires behind the throne. And so naturally, he attracted enemies. One evening, while traveling, he was approached by a man disguised as a wandering holy figure. A moment of conversation, perhaps even a blessing, and then steel. Nizam al-Mulk fell, and once again the assassins had shown their reach. But pause for a moment. Think of that nameless assassin. He had likely lived weeks, even months, preparing for this encounter. Every day, carrying the secret knowledge that he would not return alive. He managed his strike. He achieved what he was told was glory. And then, of course, he died. The man he killed is remembered in history books. The assassin himself is just a footnote, barely more than a shadow. Success meant death. Of course, not every attempt ended so cleanly. There were failures, and failures, as we've said, were much worse. One of the most famous failures happened in 1176 during an attempt to kill Saladin himself. Saladin, the great Muslim leader who fought against the Crusaders, was besieging a fortress when suddenly assassins burst into his camp. Daggers drawn, they came close, frighteningly close, but failed to strike the fatal blow. Saladin's guards cut them down, and the survivors were interrogated. The details are not pleasant. But the important point is this: even a man as powerful as Saladin, surrounded by an army, lived in fear of these shadows. That fear was part of the weapon. The attempt failed. The assassins died in agony. But the message? That survived. And perhaps that was enough for their leaders. Not for the assassins themselves, of course. They ended up as examples of what happened when you missed. Failure meant death. Another attempt, less well known, targeted King Richard the Lionheart. Yes, our very own crusading celebrity. Rumors swirled that assassins were sent to strike him during his campaigns in the Holy Land. Whether they truly reached him or not is still debated. But the fact that chroniclers even mentioned it shows how far the reputation of the sect had spread. People believed they could strike anywhere, at anyone, even kings. But again, let's step back from the myth and focus on the reality. Assassins did not live glamorous lives. They didn't have secret codes or gadgets. They didn't vault from rooftops or vanish in clouds of smoke. They simply walked into danger with a dagger and the knowledge that their odds of survival were precisely zero. What kept them going was the legend, the promise that their sacrifice meant something larger. Now here's the cruel irony. Most of these missions, even the successful ones, changed very little. Conrad's death did not end the Crusades. Nizam al-Mulk's assassination did not stop the Seljuks from fighting on. Even Saladin, after his narrow escape, carried on as before. The wheel of history rolled forward, barely noticing the blood of these young men. Their leaders gained reputation. Their enemies trembled, but the assassins themselves, they were gone, quickly and quietly. Still, the failures are strangely compelling. Imagine the tension of creeping close to your target, dagger hidden, disguise in place, heart hammering. One wrong glance, one loose word, and suddenly the mission is over. Soldiers drag you away, and then the slow, humiliating end begins. The crowd gathers. The punishment unfolds. Your story ends, not with glory, but with screams. And somewhere far away, your leader sighs and sends another recruit to take your place. It's worth repeating the refrain here, because it carries the rhythm of their lives. Success meant death. Failure meant death. Hesitation meant death. The only difference was how quickly the end arrived. And yet, somehow, the legend endured. Later writers made them into mysterious masterminds, hidden in mountain fortresses, commanding loyalty with a glance. They became the archetype of the shadowy killer, the terror lurking behind thrones. In reality, they were frightened young men sent on impossible missions with no way back. Their lives were short, their names forgotten, and their successes often hollow. But the myth? The myth had a very long life indeed. So let's drift forward. We've explored their missions, their triumphs, their failures. But what about the tools of their trade? Because if you're picturing sleek daggers and clever poisons, you might want to think again. The reality of their equipment was just as clumsy, uncomfortable, and unglamorous as everything else in their lives. And that is where we'll wander next. When people today think of assassins, their minds often drift to sleek daggers, exotic poisons, or clever disguises, perhaps even secret crossbows hidden in sleeves. or blades that spring from wrists at the touch of a button. Thank you, video games. The truth, though, was a little less glamorous. Or more accurately, it was a lot less glamorous. The average assassin's toolkit was not a chest of glittering weapons. It was a dagger, sometimes a short sword, maybe, if you were very lucky, a bit of poison. And disguises, yes, but not the kind involving masks and dark cloaks. More like wearing the same itchy wool robe as the monk next to you. Effective? Occasionally. Comfortable? Absolutely not. Let's begin with the dagger. It was the bread and butter of the trade. Iron or steel, double-edged, often not particularly sharp by our standards. These weapons were not designed for elegance. They were designed to stab someone at close range. And that meant you had to be right there within arm's reach. No long-distance safety. No chance to run away before the deed was noticed. The dagger was brutally simple. It got the job done, but at the highest possible personal risk. And here's the thing. The dagger was not always effective. Medieval clothing could be surprisingly thick. Quilted tunics, padded armor, mail shirts. These could turn a quick thrust into an awkward jab, which meant the assassin had to strike multiple times, quickly, and with force. The elegant image of a single, clean strike? That was rare. Most accounts describe repeated stabbings, frantic movements, blood everywhere, and an assassin who probably wished he had picked another career. Then there was poison. Ah yes, poison. The glamorous tool of secret killers in every story since the dawn of time. The problem? Medieval poison was wildly unreliable. Some worked slowly. Some didn't work at all. Some killed the wrong person because the victim passed the cup to a guest. And preparing poison wasn't exactly easy. It wasn't a quick trip to the apothecary. It often involved grinding questionable plants, boiling mysterious substances, and hoping you didn't kill yourself in the process. And of course, poison required patience. It could take hours or even days to work, which meant your target might realize what was happening, call for help, or just vomit it all out. There were cases where poisoning attempts failed so miserably that the would-be victim simply switched meals with the assassin's friend. Awkward. Once again, success was never guaranteed, and failure meant a very public, very unpleasant ending. What about disguises? Surely assassins had at least one glamorous trick here. Well, sort of. Their disguises relied on blending into local communities. Monks' robes, merchants' tunics, servant clothing. The idea was not to dazzle, but to be invisible. It worked sometimes, as with the killers of Conrad of Montferrat. But the disguises themselves were uncomfortable, itchy, and often involved weeks of pretending to live a life you had no real interest in. Imagine being told you had to pose as a traveling monk for months, chanting prayers, living on meager rations, rising at dawn, all while waiting for the chance to kill a stranger. Not glamorous, just miserable. Then there's the myth of rooftop chases. Modern fiction gives us images of assassins darting across tiles, leaping between buildings, vanishing into the skyline. The reality? Medieval rooftops were not built for parkour. Tiles slipped. Thatched roofs collapsed. and most assassins wore heavy robes, not flexible leather armor. Running on rooftops would likely have resulted in a broken ankle and a very confused local farmer watching a would-be killer tumble into a haystack. The truth was slower, duller, and clumsier. Walking through crowds, keeping your head down, waiting for your moment. Even horses were unreliable tools. Assassins did not typically gallop away into the night. First of all, horses were expensive. Second, nothing drew attention faster than a man in a panic, spurring a horse at top speed through narrow medieval streets. An assassin's best hope was to accept that he wasn't going anywhere after the deed. He'd be cut down on the spot, or perhaps arrested. Escape was not part of the plan, which, again, raises the obvious question: why anyone agreed to this life at all? Perhaps the most depressing tool of the trade wasn't a weapon at all. It was fear. The true power of the sect lay not in its daggers, not in its poisons, but in the dread that spread through courts and castles. Kings looked over their shoulders. Generals wondered about the loyalty of their servants. Even rumors of an assassin's presence could paralyze decision-making. In a sense, the assassins themselves were disposable tools. Their lives were spent cheaply to create an atmosphere of fear that lasted far longer than they did. Let's circle back to our little refrain. Success meant death. Failure meant death. The tools didn't change that. The dagger brought you close enough to be killed immediately afterward. Poison gave you time to be discovered and tortured. Disguises worked until someone noticed your accent was a little off. And even if everything went perfectly, your role ended in the same way. Cut down by guards, torn apart by mobs, or simply erased by history. And yet, the myth grew. Later generations imagined sleek, efficient killers wielding elegant blades and clever gadgets. They pictured rooftop escapes and hidden arsenals. But the real assassins had crude weapons, itchy disguises, and terrible odds. Their tools were as clumsy and uncomfortable as the lives they lived. So where does that leave us? We've looked at the lives of the assassins, their training, their missions, their failures, and their pitiful tools. But what about the constant fear that followed them every day, even when they weren't on missions? The paranoia of betrayal, of suspicion, of living in a sect where trust was almost impossible. That's where we'll wander next, into the endless fear of discovery. Because if being sent on a mission was bad, waiting to be discovered at home wasn't much better. We left off with the humble dagger, the clumsy poison, the itchy robe, and the myth of rooftop parkour. But let's linger a little longer, because the assassin's so-called arsenal deserves more than a passing glance. After all, these were the tools that determined whether a man lived, died, or simply embarrassed himself in front of a royal court. Take the dagger again. It seems simple, but the reality was awkward. Daggers had to be hidden, usually beneath robes or cloaks. This meant easy access was nearly impossible. Imagine fumbling under a heavy wool tunic while guards stared at you, wondering why you were patting yourself like you'd misplaced a coin. Smooth assassinations were rare. Awkward, sweaty, drawn-out struggles were far more common. And the more one struggled, the less assassin he looked and the more panicked criminal he resembled. And cleaning a dagger? That was another issue. Iron rusted. Steel dulled quickly. A weapon used once might not even pierce the next heavily padded target. Maintenance was necessary, but constant maintenance was suspicious. One didn't simply sit in a tavern, oiling a dagger, without drawing attention, which meant assassins often went into missions with subpar tools. And yes, blunt daggers made everything worse. Poison deserves its own sad chapter. Recipes were passed around like precious secrets, whispered between apothecaries, alchemists, and whoever was desperate enough to ask. Hemlock, belladonna, arsenic, aconite, names that sound sinister, but in practice they often caused little more than stomach cramps or vomiting. Imagine carefully preparing your lethal dose, slipping it into a goblet of wine, and then watching your target stagger, hiccup, and recover with nothing more than a mild headache. Congratulations. You've just exposed yourself for nothing. And here's the ironic part. Poisons were not just unreliable, they were dangerous to carry. A little too much powder spilled in your pouch, and suddenly you were the victim. A careless scratch on the hand could end your mission before it began. There are accounts of would-be poisoners dying in their sleep because they stored their concoctions poorly. Again, glamorous? Not even remotely. Disguises were another so-called tool, but they were more like uncomfortable obligations. Dressing as a monk, for example, wasn't just about wearing a robe. It meant living the monk's life, chanting prayers, fasting, pretending to know scripture by heart. And if you slipped up, if you muttered the wrong response, mispronounced a psalm, or fell asleep during prayers, someone noticed. And suspicion spread fast in medieval communities. Outsiders were rarely trusted, so your disguise had an expiration date, and it usually ticked down far quicker than you expected. Merchants were another common cover. Assassins posed as traders, moving with caravans, selling wares. But this meant carrying actual goods, cloth, spices, grain, and yes, that meant actually trading them, which meant haggling with locals, paying taxes at city gates, bribing officials. Not exactly thrilling work for someone supposedly on a mission of death. And imagine how awkward it was when a potential customer haggled for too long over your disguised merchandise while you were trying not to lose track of your target. Even servants made risky disguises. Castles were full of them, true, but servants knew one another. You couldn't just slip in with a tray and expect no one to notice. Someone always asked the same fatal question, "Who are you again?" And once that question was asked, your odds of survival plummeted. Let's not forget weapons like bows or crossbows. From a distance, they seemed like safer options, except they weren't. Bows required space to draw, and guards always noticed someone fumbling with one indoors. Crossbows were slower than you think, heavy to carry, and expensive. Worse, they made noise. That loud twang might as well have been a bell announcing, "The assassin is right here." And rooftops? Still a myth. But let's imagine, for the sake of fun, an assassin trying, balancing on uneven tiles, slipping on morning dew, dodging chimneys, all while wearing robes and boots designed for walking, not leaping. Medieval roofs were not designed for running. They were designed to keep out rain, and usually they failed even at that. So the assassin's toolkit boiled down to this: a dagger that rusted, poison that didn't always work, disguises that fooled no one for long, and rooftops that were better left to cats. Not exactly the sleek arsenal we like to imagine. And here's the subtle irony: the most effective tool wasn't material at all, it was reputation. The mere idea of assassins lurking somewhere faceless, ready to strike, did more damage than the assassins themselves ever could. A whispered rumor could unsettle an entire kingdom. A rumor of an assassin in the city might cause a king to lock himself in his chamber, refuse to eat, and send guards searching endlessly. In that sense, the real weapon was fear. But fear works both ways. Assassins themselves lived in constant fear of exposure, of betrayal, of failure. And that is where our path is leading. Because if their daggers were blunt and their poisons unreliable, the one sharp reality of their world was paranoia. And so, let's drift forward into the endless fear of discovery, where even at home, surrounded by their own, the assassin's life was never truly safe. If there was one thing sharper than an assassin's dagger, it was the constant edge of paranoia. Because here's the truth: most assassins didn't die in glorious, cinematic duels. They died in alleys, or on racks, or by the betrayal of someone they thought was a friend. In many ways, their greatest enemy wasn't the target. It was time. The longer they lived, the greater the odds that someone would notice, someone would talk, or someone would decide their usefulness had run its course. Let's begin with betrayal. The assassin's world was built on secrecy, but secrets are fragile things. Money, fear, or even mild inconvenience could make someone break. And once a whisper started, it traveled faster than a dagger thrust. A tavern keeper might mention a strange guest with calloused hands. A servant might notice a fellow worker doesn't seem to know anyone's name. And just like that, suspicion snowballed. And suspicion, in the Middle Ages, was usually enough. There wasn't exactly a fair trial waiting for you. If someone thought you looked odd, you could be dragged before guards, questioned, and encouraged to confess. Encouragement usually meant iron instruments, heated coals, or just blunt force. And under those conditions, even the most loyal assassin eventually spilled. Because yes, training could prepare you for hardship, but no amount of training could prepare you for medieval torture chambers, where creativity and cruelty went hand in hand. Let's pause on that. Imagine the paranoia of walking into a city, knowing every interaction might be your last. The wrong answer to a guard, the wrong accent overheard by a merchant, the wrong coin given to a gatekeeper. Every single moment could unravel your disguise. The myth of the fearless assassin collapses here. Most were likely trembling, exhausted, and constantly scanning every face for signs of suspicion. And then there was the fear from within. Assassin groups weren't exactly warm and welcoming communities. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. Leaders knew that loyalty faded, so they kept members in line through fear. Fear of expulsion, fear of punishment, fear of being removed quietly in the night. Because if you displeased your masters, They wouldn't waste time with apologies. They'd make an example of you. Let's imagine that for a moment. You've dedicated your life to the cause. You've endured training, discomfort, and endless missions. You've risked your life a dozen times over, and one slip, one careless word, one rumor of hesitation, and suddenly you're no longer trusted. No retirement ceremony, no gold watch, just a quiet disappearance. Perhaps a body discovered in a river weeks later, or perhaps nothing at all. This constant fear seeped into every part of their lives. Eating could feel dangerous. Was the bread safe? Was the wine spiced with something lethal? Sleeping was a gamble. Who was standing watch? And were they truly loyal? Even speaking was dangerous. Too much silence made you seem suspicious. Too much talk risked revealing something you shouldn't. And what about missions that went wrong? Those were the worst of all. Because survival didn't mean success if you returned alive, but failed, you often faced punishment harsher than death. Leaders didn't want excuses. They wanted results. A failed assassin was not just a disappointment. He was a liability. He knew secrets. He had been seen. He might be captured. So sometimes, the safest option for the group was to silence their own. It's worth pausing to notice how absurdly miserable this existence was. You weren't just risking death by the sword. You were risking death by gossip, by accident, by suspicion, by failure. You were constantly walking on eggshells, and the eggshells were made of glass. And the reward? Barely anything. A small stipend, maybe food, maybe shelter in a fortress far from civilization. There was no noble retirement waiting, no legend sung in taverns, at least not accurate ones. History did the assassins no favors. When they were remembered, it was usually as shadows in the margins of larger stories. Tools, not people. Names were forgotten. Deaths were unmarked. The irony is almost poetic. They lived in fear, died in silence, and were remembered only in distorted legends. Their reality was stripped away, replaced by myths of fearless, silent killers. But the truth, as we keep circling back to, was much duller. They weren't sleek blades in the night. They were nervous men with blunt daggers and a constant headache. So, the endless fear of discovery wasn't a footnote to their lives. It was their lives. Waking each day, knowing you could be betrayed, captured, punished, or discarded. And this fear didn't end until death, which usually came far earlier than anyone hoped. And with that, we begin to see the final chapter forming. Because after endless paranoia, after failure and betrayal, we're left with one final piece, the so-called legacy of assassins. How history remembered them, how myths replaced reality, and how, in the end, their lives were less about glory and more about being chewed up and forgotten by the very world they served. Let's drift there next, into the last stage of this weary journey, the legacy of assassins shinier on parchment than it ever was in real life. If there was one thing sharper than an assassin's dagger, it was the constant edge of paranoia. Because here's the truth, most assassins didn't die in glorious, cinematic duels. They died in alleys, or on racks, or by the betrayal of someone they thought was a friend. In many ways, their greatest enemy wasn't the target. It was time. The longer they lived, the greater the odds that someone would notice, someone would talk, or someone would decide their usefulness had run its course. Let's begin with betrayal. The assassin's world was built on secrecy, but secrets are fragile things. Money, fear, or even mild inconvenience could make someone break. And once a whisper started, it traveled faster than a dagger thrust. A tavern keeper might mention the strange guest with calloused hands. A servant might notice a fellow worker doesn't seem to know anyone's name. And just like that, suspicion snowballed. And suspicion, in the Middle Ages, was usually enough. There wasn't exactly a fair trial waiting for you. If someone thought you looked odd, you could be dragged before guards, questioned, and encouraged to confess. Encouragement usually meant iron instruments, heated coals, or just blunt force. And under those conditions, even the most loyal assassin eventually spilled. Because yes, training could prepare you for hardship, but no amount of training could prepare you for medieval torture chambers, where creativity and cruelty went hand in hand. One story often whispered is that of a hired killer in the employ of an Italian noble family. He had successfully dispatched one rival, but in a cruel twist, his employer's cousin decided to save money by turning him into the authorities. Convenient, efficient, and cheaper than paying his fee. The assassin was caught, interrogated, and after a few days of unpleasant persuasion, named everyone he had ever spoken to. He didn't last long after that, and neither did most of his supposed allies. It's a sharp reminder that in this line of work, your boss was often your biggest danger. Another tale comes from the Crusader states, where European lords swore endlessly about Saracen assassins hiding in every shadow. In one case, a knight swore he had discovered such a killer among his servants. Whether the man truly was or not barely mattered. He was arrested, tortured, and executed without trial, without evidence. Fear was enough. So yes, sometimes the assassin's paranoia wasn't even misplaced. Sometimes suspicion alone killed faster than any blade. And then there was the fear from within. Assassin groups weren't exactly warm and welcoming communities. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. Leaders knew that loyalty faded, so they kept members in line through fear. Fear of expulsion, fear of punishment, fear of being removed quietly in the night. Because if you displeased your masters, they wouldn't waste time with apologies. They'd make an example of you. This constant fear seeped into every part of their lives. Eating could feel dangerous. Was the bread safe? Was the wine spiced with something lethal? Sleeping was a gamble. Who was standing watch? And were they truly loyal? Even speaking was dangerous. Too much silence made you seem suspicious. Too much talk risked revealing something you shouldn't. And what about missions that went wrong? Those were the worst of all. Because survival didn't mean success if you returned alive, but failed, you often faced punishment harsher than death. Leaders didn't want excuses. They wanted results. A failed assassin was not just a disappointment. He was a liability. He knew secrets. He had been seen. He might be captured. So sometimes the safest option for the group was to silence their own. It's worth pausing to notice how absurdly miserable this existence was. You weren't just risking death by the sword. You were risking death by gossip, by accident, by suspicion, by failure. You were constantly walking on eggshells, and the eggshells were made of glass. The irony is almost poetic. They lived in fear, died in silence, and were remembered only in distorted legends. Their reality was stripped away, replaced by myths of fearless, silent killers. But the truth, as we keep circling back to, was much duller. They weren't sleek blades in the night. They were nervous men with blunt daggers and a constant headache. So the endless fear of discovery wasn't a footnote to their lives. It was their lives, waking each day, knowing you could be betrayed, captured, punished, or discarded. And this fear didn't end until death, which usually came far earlier than anyone hoped. And with that, we begin to see the final chapter forming. Because after endless paranoia, after failure and betrayal, we're left with one final piece, the so-called legacy of assassins. How history remembered them, how myths replaced reality, and how, in the end, their lives were less about glory and more about being chewed up and forgotten by the very world they served. Let's drift there next, into the last stage of this weary journey, the legacy of assassins, shinier on parchment than it ever was in real life. So here we are at the quiet end of our journey. After all the exhaustion, paranoia, betrayals, and early deaths, what remains? What do assassins leave behind except a few broken daggers and nervous glances? Oddly enough, they left a legend, and like most legends, it was far kinder to them than real life ever was. You see, medieval assassins became far more interesting after they were dead. Chroniclers loved to exaggerate, travelers loved to embellish, and frightened nobles loved to whisper about shadowy figures who could appear at any moment. It was safer and frankly more entertaining to believe in a vast, mysterious network of perfect killers rather than a handful of tired men in scratchy wool trying not to sneeze during a mission. The Crusaders in particular were guilty of this. European knights came back from the Middle East spinning tales of the assassins, a secret order so devoted to their cause that they would leap off cliffs at a master's command. Did that actually happen? Probably not. But it sounded dramatic, and medieval audiences adored a bit of drama, especially when it wasn't happening to them. The stories grew more absurd with each retelling. Supposedly, assassins were drugged with hashish and promised paradise if they served loyally. Historians have spent centuries debating whether this was true or just an exotic rumor cooked up by people who didn't understand what they were looking at. But either way, it stuck. Even the word assassin that we use today traces back to these stories, a linguistic fossil from old rumors, fossilized into something permanent. And then came the romantic retellings. Poets, chroniclers, and eventually novelists painted assassins as noble, tragic figures, deadly but glamorous, silent but loyal. They became less like nervous hired killers and more like characters out of a bedtime story. The shadow slipping through castle corridors, the masked man appearing just long enough to deliver justice before fading away again. In reality, of course, most assassins had the stealth skills of a brick wall and the glamour of a man who hadn't bathed in 3 weeks. But myths don't care about hygiene. What's most ironic is that the assassins themselves didn't really control their legacy. Others wrote it for them. Nobles who wanted to justify paranoia, chroniclers who wanted a good story, rulers who wanted to frighten enemies, and eventually novelists and screenwriters who wanted a marketable anti-hero. Each layer of storytelling made the assassin larger than life, until the miserable truth was lost underneath. And so the legacy split in two. On one side, the grim reality, men living in constant fear, trapped by duty and forgotten as soon as they failed. On the other side, the legend, fearless shadows, blades in the night, symbols of loyalty and devotion. Which version do we remember today? Well, just look at the endless novels, video games, and films. The legend won. But perhaps there's a certain kindness in that. After all, most assassins lived wretched lives and died anonymously. Maybe it's almost comforting that centuries later, we still speak of them, even if the version we tell is wildly inaccurate. History often does this, replacing suffering with story, reality with romance. The truth may be dull, but the legend keeps us awake at night, or, in this case, helps us drift gently to sleep. So, why did it suck to be a medieval assassin? Because the pay was terrible, the risks were constant, the loyalty was fragile, and the chances of survival were slim. But in the end, their legacy escaped them. They may have lived and died in fear, but history remembered them as something far greater. A reminder, perhaps, that the past is always edited, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And with that, we can close the scroll, set the daggers aside, and let the noise of paranoia fade away. You don't have to fear betrayal here, just a soft sigh of history, settling back into the quiet. So tonight, when you hear the word assassin, you'll know the truth. Behind the legend was a life that was anything but glamorous. And if nothing else, it should make your own bed feel a little safer and a lot more comfortable than theirs ever was. Rest easy. History has finished whispering for now.